Welcome to our first webinar as Dexter Energy. Today I will talk to you about key challenges in making a reliable price forecasting backtest. We chose to go for this topic as we noticed that a lot of parties in the market struggle with it, and we wanted to get the discussion on it going essentially. First, some logistics. To actually help get the discussion going, there's a way for you to post questions and remarks in the chat section that requires a bit of explanation. So if you type in the chat section, you have to press the question mark, which will then turn blue. If you then submit your question, it actually is flagged as a question and not as a chat message. Right. Having said that, with me here today is Andy, who essentially organized the event. He will help me today with the online logistics. Let's get started, I guess. And I'm also happy he's here because then I'm not just talking to an empty room, so that also helps. First, a short personal introduction. So my name is Tom Lemmens. I have a background in data science and short-term power trading. And currently at Dexter Energy, I lead all the machine learning product teams. So Dexter Energy is a software company based in Amsterdam. Pretty proud to share actually that earlier this year, we closed, end of Q1, we closed a funding round of 10.5 million euros, money we will use to expand our products and to also roll out our products in Europe. And to do so, we obviously have to grow our team, right? So we started the year with 35, currently with about 50 people, and we intend to close off this year with about 80 people. So we, as a company, aim to optimize the short-term trading cycle. And we do so by providing generation forecasting services of wind and solar power. We offer trade optimization services for the short-term trade cycle. And we do asset optimization, mainly for batteries and curtailing of wind and solar power, based on a price forecast. So currently, we're mostly active in the Netherlands, Belgium, Germany, Italy, and Romania, and we intend to expand our services in Europe. First on the list is the UK, and after that, likely also France, and then the rest. So before I actually introduce the agenda for today, I wanted to introduce an example price forecasting setup. So if you consider this day-ahead trading strategy, it has a typical flow, right? It goes from data, weather forecast, market data, which flows into a price model, which outputs a forecasted price based on which a trading decision is made. And after this trading decision, you can calculate the expected profit. Now, this is the example, so a day-ahead trading strategy. I'll use this example throughout the presentation to make it a bit more concrete. Here's what could happen is, for example, you have an expected spot price of 150 euros per megawatt hour, expected imbalance price of 50 euros per megawatt hour. Spot is higher than imbalance, so you sell on spot to then buy 10 megawatt hours back on the imbalance market. Now, the expected profit based on this is 10 megawatt hours times 100 euros profit, which equals 1K. Looks good, right? Now, the backtest for this strategy actually looks promising. As you see in this graph, you see the cumulative profit over time, which is steadily increasing, right? I would say this looks really good. And now I want to ask you guys an honest question for you to consider for yourself. Who recognizes the following? A model performing exceptionally well in backtesting, which then fails to deliver the same results in production, right? Same thing, surprise, also happens for this example. After go live, which is the vertical dotted line, the production results are completely different, show a completely different trend, different behavior from the backtest results. Sadly, that's disappointing. Now, the big question is, of course, why? What happened? Now, this is exactly the question we aim to answer today, and also how to actually address the problems. So today I will address 3 challenges in making a reliable backtest. 3 topics. First, it's about the data setup. Second is about the model validation setup. And thirdly, finally, it's about the market impact, how to assess that. So the fact that your trading decisions will have an impact on the market and how to cope with that. More on that later. First, we'll go into the data part. So here's a time series of a price in euros per megawatt hour that you want to forecast. The green dotted line here is the prediction time, so the time at which you want to make a forecast. The green data is before that time, so this is data that is known to you at the time you make a prediction. The red data, that part, is unknown. Now, I want to introduce a concept which is called temporal leakage, which essentially means that you use data which is in your prediction, which is not available to you at prediction time. By using data essentially from the future, the results you get from your backtest will be inherently overly optimistic because you would have used data that is more information rich, but that would not have been available to you. Now, there's different degrees of severity, and the more severe the leakage, the bigger the impact on your results, right? So these different degrees of severity, I want to show you some examples for our day ahead example again. So first is a pretty mild form of leakage, which is if you use in your day ahead forecast, you use the average monthly temperature while you're still in the middle of the month, right? So you use the average temperature of the calendar month, but you're only halfway in, so half of the data is still unknown. Mild form of the leakage. A more severe form, a mid-level form, I would say, is if you use for a day-ahead forecast, you use the intraday weather forecast. Since weather forecasts have a pretty big impact on the expected prices, I would flag this as medium form or medium severe form of temporal leakage. Now, the most severe form would be if you essentially have target leakage. So if you leak price information from the future in your forecast. In this case, the example is if you use the actual day ahead price. Now, if you forecast a day ahead price and you feed the actual day ahead price in your model, then hopefully, because that means your model is functioning, you get a perfect forecast that you will notice. But more subtle is if you forecast imbalance price and you leak the day ahead price into that, obviously that will have a big impact as well, but that might be a bit more difficult to spot already. Now, how can you actually handle this? How should you handle this? A solution for this is to version your data. By versioning your data, you're able to reliably access the latest available data that you would have had. Now take this example of a wind speed forecast. Every time a new wind speed forecast or measurement is published, you store it and you keep the old one and you version it. You version it by means of labeling it with the time at which the data became available, the available time in the first column. All of these rows represent the same or represent weather at the same time of delivery, right? So the valid time. So June 7th from 12 to 1. Now, the big question is, which of these wind speed forecasts could we have used in a day ahead forecast? That's a question you guys can all answer in this interactive survey I will publish in a second, but first I'll walk you through it. So it's a day ahead forecast running at noon, June 6th, which is valid for the day after, June 7th, from 12 to 1. There's 4 options you can choose from. First one is June 6th, 6 in the morning. Second, 11 in the morning, still a forecast. Then the third option is the intraday forecast, issued June 7th at 6 in the morning. And finally, June 7th, and at the end of the day, you actually have a weather measurement. Now, which of these 4 should you use for your day ahead forecast? I'm going to publish a survey now. And if all goes well, you should now see this and you should be able to vote. And it's indeed working because I see votes coming in. I'll give you guys, I don't know, 10 seconds. All right. Now I press this and I think you should see the results. Share results. Here they come. So this is what you guys thought. And I guess you guys are right. So if we go to the results, indeed, 3 and 4 you could not have used because they would not have been available to you at time of forecasting. Then option 1 and 2 you could have used, and I would have actually also argued to use option 2 because that would have been fresher data than option 1, right? So probably more information rich. Now, the learning from this is that you should version your data, you should store all updates and timestamp it with the available at time to prevent temporal leakage. Now, there are some challenges with this, of course. First challenge is that you need a different form of data storage or a slightly more advanced way, but because you need to store more data, so you need to be able to handle this. Second is how to handle new data sources. For example, if you want to connect a new data source, you would also need to have this historical data, right? And this data we have noticed is not always or even typically not available in the market. So most market parties, most data vendors or public data sources, they don't always have this data available. So how we handle this now is that we essentially are building an archive for ourselves for publicly available data. But that is definitely a challenge with this. So the second topic I want to address today is about the model validation setup. The big challenge there, the big problem there is that the way you simulate on historical data is not equal to the way your production setup behaves. As a result, likely your production and backtesting results will not be similar. And because your setup is different, it will be very difficult to pinpoint where this difference comes from. And therefore, I guess my thoughts with this are always that for this, you really have to move slow to after that move fast, right? You really have to invest in building a solid model validation framework. You have to invest in this. I will discuss some of the typical challenges that you'll actually have with this. First one is about the retraining logic. So say in production, you retrain and you forecast on a daily basis. Then I would argue that also in a backtest, you would have to retrain and predict on a daily basis. So that would look like this, right? Where you have a fold every day. So every day you train, you predict, you train, you predict, right? It's this typical time series cross-validation visual. But alternatively, say you are unable to automatically retrain in production every day. Instead, you retrain your model every month manually, which can be perfectly sensible. You need to make sure that also in a backtest, you need to you need to resemble this behavior, right? So you need to make sure that in that case, you also retrain monthly and not daily. A second challenge is about code similarity. Now assume that you have an extra data filter in production. For example, you filter outliers. In production, you don't do this in a backtest. Or there's a subtle difference in feature engineering because your code base is not similar. For example, in production, you use a trailing moving average for temperature, and in a backtest, you use a centered moving average. This will lead to different results, and the best way by far to address this is to really optimize for code similarity between production and backtesting. You can do this by building shared libraries, for example. There's plenty of other solutions for this. But the more similar your code base, the easier it is to prevent mistakes. The third option is about versioning. Now, what I've noticed is that typical production setups are almost always built for reproducibility. However, for backtesting results or backtesting setups, that's not always the case. And as a result there, what you might see is that, for example, the only thing saved for a backtest are the results, right? Which could be a graph of cumulative profit or just some hard statistics, but not how you actually got to those results. Now imagine you go to production, model is disappointing, you want to find out why, but it's very difficult then to find out what notebook maybe was used to get to these results exactly, which data was used, what version of the different pre-processing steps. Another example would be that you want to compare a new model you've developed with a model you've developed 6 months ago, right? To see how much you've improved since then. Also, in this case, you need to be able to exactly pinpoint what code was used to create results at that time. Now, the solution for this would be to version your pipeline end to end. So from data all the way to results. So you version your data, you version your code base, you even version results, such that you can link everything together. Now, these are just 3 tips for setting up your model validation framework. There's plenty of more things to say about this, but I really think that if you stick to these tips, you already are well on your way on having a more reliable model validation framework. Now, the third part of what we want to discuss today is about handling market impact. Now, remember, this was the setup we have, where we have a forecasted price based on which we take a trading decision, and then you calculate your profit. Now, my statement is that if you do it like this leads to unrealistic and overly optimistic results. Because the profit you calculate like this is based on historical prices, while in reality, the trading decision you make lead to have a volume impact, right? They impact the balance between demand and supply on the market, which then leads to a price impact. So I would argue that you need to take this price impact into account when calculating your profit. Now, how to do this? That's what I'll discuss in a minute. First, a quick recap on how this market impact fundamentally works, right? So example again for the day ahead strategy, here's the baseline situation where no action is taken. You see the day ahead demand and supply curves where they meet, that's where the day ahead price is. No surprise for most of you. Now, assume you sell on day ahead, putting downward pressure on, or you actually shift the supply curve to the right, downward pressure on the price. Similarly for the imbalance price, right? Here's the imbalance bid ladder, which is how it works in most of Europe, where you have an imbalance volume, which then leads to the amount of activated assets, which then lead to the imbalance price. Now you sold on day ahead, you buy back on imbalance, that's the simple strategy. There's more volume activated, in this case actually a new bid is hit, which leads to an increase in price. Now what happens is this, right? You assume this price spread, but there's downward pressure on the day ahead price, upward pressure on the imbalance price, so the price spread actually decreases. Now, how do you model for this price impact? First, you have to recognize that profit isn't equal to volume times price, it's equal to volume times price corrected for price impact. Two simple ways. I will share two simple ways of how you can address this. But first, some assumptions that you have to make for that, and that is, in this case, the methods I present, they assume that the biggest impact is on the imbalance market, because those markets typically have more elasticity than day ahead. And the second assumption is that it's mostly about small volumes. Now, the other thing you have to take into account, what I'll present is really aimed to correct for backtesting results, right? This is not how you use it in production. This is to correct for backtesting results and to make backtesting results more reliable. So first approach to estimate the price impact is, like I just shared, you use the bid ladder. So you use the historical bid ladder data, you collect the data, which is not always trivial, but you can do it. You can collect the bid ladder data. You take the volume that you want to trade. You look up which new bid would have been activated, and this gives you the price impact, right? It's the price delta. Then the alternative approach is a more statistical approach, where you gather the historical actual imbalance volume and imbalance price pairs, you plot them, you have the scatter plot, and you find the relation between them. In this case, a simple linear relation. Now, what you can do then is, again, you have the volume, you can shift the volume, and you can look up the new spot on the fitted line, which then gives you the new imbalance price, right? This is the more statistical approach to it. Now, again, right, there are some oversimplification going on here. You assume that, for instance, in the statistical approach, there's a linear relation. This likely only works for small volumes. You ignore the day ahead price impact. Still, I would argue that you have to take this price impact into account some way, because otherwise you're fooling yourself. So to summarize, three key takeaways. First, you have to be rigorous in mimicking your production setup when doing a backtest. Second, be aware of market impact and correct for it accordingly. And thirdly, as an important footnote to everything we just discussed, the whole system is rapidly transitioning. Everything is changing. So even though your hindcasting setup is perfect, the past performance is sadly not a perfect indicator of future performance. Having said that, that was the content part of today. Before we go to the Q&A section, for which I'll ask Andy to help me out a bit, quick announcement. Like we said, we're actively growing the team. There's a lot of very interesting technical open positions for which you can check the website. And having said that, I think it's time to go to Q&A. We're waiting. I'm going to check if there's actually push the buttons to see if there's questions coming in. So if you have any questions or thoughts, please share them via the chat, and then we'll see if we can address them. I think there's actually a couple coming in now. Now, if I press this, publish, publish. So what are your thoughts on market self-cannibalization by large-scale deployment of battery storage for electricity trading throughout the Netherlands? So it's essentially the fact, at what point are there enough batteries, and at what point will the market actually flatten out? It's our belief that Batteries will definitely be a huge damping factor on the market, but before you'll start noticing the dampening effect, first it's going to get much worse before it gets any better. So short term, I think the answer is it's going to get much worse. Long term, obviously, if you add a lot more damping to the market, then the volatility will decrease. Next question. Let's see. Yeah, so does Dexter work on trading at the greater horizon than day ahead? No, we do not. Our focus is really the short-term trade cycle, right? So we are active on the day-ahead market. We're getting more active on the intraday market, and we're already active on the imbalance market. But we have noticed that more parties are also getting more active on the sort of mid-term markets, right? So up to a week ahead or weeks ahead even. But this is not a market this is not a space we are active in. Let's see if there's more prices. So there's the killer question: what AI models are we using to forecast these type of problems? So there's a couple of problems addressed, but typically, so if we go to the time series forecasting case, I think it's a regression problem. It's a structured time series forecasting problem, and I think that for these type of forecasts, there's two things that are key to take into account, or to realize that for these type of tabular problems, gradient boosted decision trees are typically the model you have to beat. So that's obviously something we use. The other thing that is important to realize is that there's a lot of value in ensembling forecasts, right? So not only using a specific gradient boosted decision tree, but perhaps combine several of them, combine different models, right? More statistical with a more fundamental approach. So that's I think two main insights for this. And next to that, the very boring yet very true answer is that almost always most value is actually in how you treat your data, right? So we spend a lot of tender love and care into which data we use, how we clean the data, how we try to understand what's happening with the data. And the other thing that I think is very important is to combine different disciplines when you build products based on this, right? So we have a pretty strong belief that the best way to solve the problem is by combining domain knowledge with modeling and software engineering skills. So we have these cross-functional teams where there's domain experts that all have to be able to code quite well as well, with people that are mainly have an excellent background, as excellent as possible in machine learning and software engineering. That's a long answer. Let's see. Oh, let's see if I understand this question. Which tools or software are used to meter data, monitor outages, and forecast prices in short-term trading markets? That's a very broad question. So first, if it's about how we collect data, right, that's the first part. We collect data from a lot of open data sources, right, all the data that the market publishes, and we buy some data as well. And then the key is to understand how they have manipulated the data, right? To what extent do they, and to what extent is there still measurement errors in there? That heavily depends on the data source. For our generation forecasting products, this is what we especially pay a lot of attention to, right? We don't just take the historical time series for granted. No, we really try to understand what's happening there. How is maintenance, for example, affecting historical power output? So again, that's an example for generation forecasting. For price forecasting, you're really depending on the market data published. And then the tools we use for price forecasting is it's essentially we're mostly a Python shop, right? So most of the things we do are with Python. All our services run in the cloud. We try to leverage managed services as much as possible. We really believe in the saying, standing on the shoulders of giants, right? We try to leverage the great work that the cloud providers are doing. And next to that, the trick is obviously in coupling everything together. Let's see. Yeah, this is the killer question. How do you ensure you do not overfit your backtest data set when you constantly iterate on the same historic time series? I think this is the key challenge with all price backtesting, because your training and your test set hardly change, right? So if you keep backtesting enough, in the end, you'll find something that works really well. I think the obvious answer is that you need to be very strict in not using your test set all the time, right? Really to like have test, validation, and training. So to also really have this holdout, this validation set. And next to that, we are pretty rigorous in significance testing, right? So how significant is this change? Can we fundamentally also explain why this works? But it is a difficult question for sure, and it's a hard problem to solve. So if you have any questions or any thoughts about that, I'd be very interested to hear about that in the chat. Then what are all markets and products you participate in? So we're active in the short-term markets. Currently, the trade strategies we have running are mostly day-ahead strategies. They take a position on day ahead, essentially. And we're getting more active in intraday trading as well. And the markets are the countries I showed at the beginning. So the Netherlands, Belgium, Italy, Romania. Yeah. So let's see, for modeling market impact, which approach out of the two presented is most common or considered the better? If both the same, what are the advantages and disadvantages of each? If the question is what is in general considered better, then my answer is that's a hard question to answer, because to be honest, there's not a lot to find on this topic. That's also why I think it was interesting to share some thoughts about this. What are some advantages and disadvantages to each? I think the ultimate advantage of the first approach, right? So the bit ladder approach is that if you can do it really well, you can completely resemble what would have happened. The disadvantage is that it's really hard to get it exactly right. The advantage of the statistical approach is that it's a bit more robust, but the disadvantage is that it's also more simplistic. I think on a very high level, that's sort of how you can look at this. I think almost last question. Looking at Andy.
There's one more question above.
Oh yeah, from Matthew. If Dexter comes up with a trading strategy, how do you get revenue from it without having your own trading book? Yes, indeed, we have this profit sharing set up with customers. So essentially, we do what we do is based on the customer's portfolio and our our price forecast. We have we deploy trading strategies, which we then on their books put in the market, and then there's a profit sharing construction. Yeah.
There's one more question from Reds.
Okay.
We're not published right now.
Oh, yeah. Okay, you have to give me a minute to read this. So you forecast both, right? You forecast the spread. So the answer is, how can you forecast, or how can you exploit the spread? If there would be a spread, the day ahead would correct for it. Well, if you look at the market, there's almost always a spread between day ahead and imbalance, right? So I think the market doesn't entirely correct for it. And if you're able to forecast the spread, you're able to monetize it. I guess maybe there's something in your question that I'm overlooking here, but that's, I guess, the short answer. Okay. More questions coming up. I'll take one more, and then I think we'll wrap up. Yeah, so what goes in essentially, right? So for trading strategies, do you guys use some forecast for fundamentals? Yes, for sure. This is what's essentially driving the market to a larger and larger extent. And which is why I think it's always also helpful that we also do generation forecasting, because we really understand well how generation forecasting of wind and solar works, how demand forecasting works. So we're able to essentially estimate the impact of wind, solar demand on the data, and also other market sources, right? We take that into account to make a price forecast. Yeah. Okay. Thanks for all your questions. I love it. Pleasure to answer them. At this time, it's time to wrap up. In case you have any questions or thoughts afterwards, please feel free to reach out to us. Wait, I can actually put that on the screen. I think there's also another email address you can reach out to. So be happy to handle any questions later as well. For now, thanks for joining. It was a pleasure to have you in and to see your questions. Maybe to next time. Have a great rest of the day. Bye-bye.